Very well, welcome back. I hope you had a good coffee break. Now we are ready for the last talk for today's session before our trip together of this afternoon, and lunch, of course. I have the pleasure of introducing Francisco Klauser, who is professor of political geography at the University of Neuchâtel in Switzerland. His work explores the socio-spatial implications, power and surveillance issues arising from the digitization of present-day life. His research topics include video surveillance, mega event security, smart city, airport security, surveillance, and big data in agriculture. In recent years, this research agenda has been pushed further in an explicitly three-dimensional way, resulting in a wide-ranging portfolio of work into the volumetric of space and power from an aerial and subterranean viewpoints on many relationships to the previous talk. In particular, Francisco Klauser was the coordinator of a 4-year research project on civil drones funded by the Swiss National Science Foundation, and has developed a strong research interest into the politics of the air in agriculture and in health politics relating to the fight against COVID-19. His empirical and theoretical ambition to develop a properly three-dimensional political geography has also led to a continued research engagement with the subterranean geographies of re-affected Swiss military bunkers. Of course, you all know he's the author of Surveillance and Space, published in 2017, which I just stole from the book stand, so you will be able to take a look at it if you already don't know it. And the title of his presentation is Policing with the Drone Towards an Aerial Geopolitics of Security. Francisco, thank you so much for being here. You have the floor.
Thank you, Alessandro, for your kind words, and thank you so much to the conference organizers, Matteo, Lucrezia, Tommaso, for the invitation. I'm more than thrilled to be here and to kind of share ideas and conversations with you together. And I think in many ways my talk connects with quite a few things that have already been said, especially, of course, with Ole's talk just before mine, because I will also be talking about drones, and I will talking about civil drones in particular, so I will not, during my talk, go into the kind of military drones, although we can, of course, discuss that, but my empirical work has not dealt explicitly with military drones or military applications of drones, but really focused on, let's say, the more civil applications. And today I will focus on one example mostly, which is the policing, but I've also been extremely interested in all kinds of other drone applications, for example, in agriculture. I mean, that has just been mentioned, but also maybe the more professional drone usage by photographers, urbanists, architects, archaeology departments. So really this kind of, I wouldn't call it democratization, but let's say proliferation of this kind of technology across a wide range and milieus of society. So my talk today connects really with quite a few different pieces I've been publishing and writing over the last couple of years, revisiting maybe also some kind of maybe a little older empirical materials, but really with this idea of using that to kind of think about the air, or think about the kind of the volumes of the everyday, as I would call it. So when I started my work on drones, when I kind of wrote that research applications, I kind of came out of previous research on video surveillance, on CCTV. And obviously the kind of the starting point was to say, well, I mean, the drones are flying CCTV cameras, and I'm saying that now, but I think actually pretty soon I realized that that's not exactly true. So, but this was for me at least the starting point, so it kind of naturally brought me to this question of the vertical gaze, what Lisa Parks has called vertical mediation, so this way of looking down from above, which of course applies to cameras on the ground, which applies to cameras in the air, which applies to drones, satellites, all kinds of other aerial techniques of vision and visualization. And I did quite a lot of work on that, and I tried throughout that work to kind of develop and think through maybe sometimes quite unexpected vocabularies to kind of grasp these kind of visual and visualizing prowess of this kind of gaze from above. So the picture you see here is from Kandinsky, and Kandinsky has really been quite an influence for me, together with Paul Klee, the Swiss painter, because both, and especially Kandinsky, they did quite a lot of theoretical work on these kind of graphic forms of abstract painting, the kind of punctual, linear and planar graphic forms, and I've tried to really apply this kind of vocabulary together with quite a few others to think about the power dimensions of the drone gaze as it falls on the ground. And not just the kind of the controlling and the kind of the visualizing capabilities involved in that drone gaze from above, but also in the specific way of acting on the ground that it mediates. So it's really less this kind of Foucauldian understanding of the drone as a technique of power, as a kind of way of acting on other actions, with this particular focus on the kind of the vertical gaze, the top-down gaze of the drone. And I will talk about this particular dimension in the third part of my talk today. So what kind of happened to me when I did that research and I was starting, maybe you could advance it. Yes, so when I was starting concretely my project, a kind of a second perspective opened up. And that kind of happened to me when I actually really started doing the empirical work. And what I realized that, so I was really expecting to work on this kind of way of looking down from above. But what I realized was that even before that, the drone made everybody look up from below. So everybody kind of to whom I started talking was kind of talking about the air in all kinds of different ways. Looking at the air, looking at the climatic conditions, the wind conditions, talking about the air, often actually quite unconsciously, but it appeared very quickly that the drone was not only a mediator of novel kind of relations through the air onto distant grounds, but also a mediator of novel relations with the space above, with the air. And so in a way, what I started doing, and I think Ole used that wonderful expression, and also you mentioned it earlier this morning, thinking with the drone. So in a way, the drone also mediated my own thinking about the air. And so that is going to be the key point of my talk today. The question I want to ask is really, in what ways does the drone make, in my case this morning, the police discover the air? In what dimensions of the air, or in what specific realms of the air does the police, or with what dimensions does the police establish novel relationships mediated through the drone? And then I take that question, that kind of empirical question, which I will actually address on some kind of quite concrete empirical data. I will use that question to kind of push it one step further and then to ask myself, well, what do I learn from that? What does this tell me about a possible conceptualization of the air? And what does that tell me as a political geographer about the possibility of a properly volumetric political geography? And I do understand political geography here in a very broad sense as the kind of as the study of the interaction between power and space. And power not just in a kind of state power sense, but really in a Foucauldian understanding of kind of a social phenomenon, something that is inherent and plays out in all kinds of relationships on all kinds of spatial and social scales, and in which space plays a role as both the product and the producer of power. And this, of course, goes back to a kind of Lefebvrean understanding of space as the product and producer of social action, in a way. So I really try to take that kind of research agenda from my discipline and through the drone problematic to kind of rethink it in a volumetric type of way. And I distill from my empirical work some dimensions of the air, which I think would be interesting to conceptualize further. So of course this is extremely exploratory, and I'm kind of starting all kinds of new questionings right now. So for example, I'm just about to submit a new research proposal on subterranean air, namely related to ancient or former military bunkers in Switzerland. I've been, as it's been mentioned, been working on COVID and the fight against COVID as a kind of era politics. So I'm really kind of playing with this and trying to kind of get a better feeling of how to combine these dimensions as well. And also, and that's where the kind of vocabulary question comes back into play, how to, through what terminology, to think about this interaction between power and space in a properly volumetric kind of type of way. So that's the key aim of my talk, and I will broadly structure it in 3 parts. So the first one is the air or the volume, the air as a volume in which to act, then on which to act, and then the third one, through which to act. So we have this kind of Lefebvrean understanding of the air as both the object, stake, and perspective of action, product and producer of social action. So the methodological approach, and I took this, again, I mean, maybe just one little comment, so I will not discuss these artistic images, these kind of paintings, but I think in many ways what I'm trying to do and what I'm trying my discipline to do, because geography, and this is actually quite a funny thing, geography wants to be the discipline of space or of the relation with space, but for a long time, and that would be my kind of critique, we have been maybe almost imprisoned in this kind of cartographic way of understanding space through all kinds of two-dimensional metaphors, points, lines, place, networks, borderlines. It's all about kind of non-dimensional or non-volumetric vocabularies. And in many ways, I think painters have actually long understood that space is a volume rather than a planar surface. So I'm kind of trying to more or less implicitly make the connection with something that, to me, kind of springs out of these paintings and which kind of really resonates quite intrinsically with what I'm trying to do in my kind of endeavor to think about these volumes of the everyday in a more systematic, geographical and conceptually driven way. And the other point I wanted to make about that particular image is that actually drones, and that maybe also adds something to Ole's talk earlier this morning, drones, in my understanding, actually are becoming ever more a rural phenomenon. I mean, that's an assumption. I'm kind of opening up for discussion, of course, but I mean, there are actually estimates who talk from international drone associations who tell that in the next couple of years, 80% of the drone market will actually relate to farming and other rural applications. So that would be a kind of a side argument to invite us to think about these kind of drone-mediated spaces beyond the urban focus. And one of the reasons for that, of course, is also that in Switzerland, as elsewhere, it is actually not allowed to use drones above crowds of people, of gatherings of people. I mean, I'm not talking about the military drones that are flying high up, I'm talking about the small engines who actually fall down quite a lot. And even the police drones, I remember there was this story about Zurich police. They were extremely proud about their new drone that had cost about 100,000 Swiss francs, so quite a nice thing. And then I think 2 weeks later it was all broken down because it fell down from the air, literally. So even the police really have to struggle with actually authorizations to use drones above urban terrain. And there is this nice anecdote from Geneva police who actually tried or wanted to use the drone to kind of monitor manifestations across the city, and who had actually to build corridors, specifically designed corridors in public space above which they could fly their drone so as to watch the adjacent places, the adjacent streets on which the manifestation was happening. So it's really interesting. I think we really have to think about these kind of volumes of the everyday also, and much more systematically as rural phenomena. So my research has been really quite heavily empirical. I would say 3 main case studies: Swiss border guards, then Neuchâtel police, which is the case study I have chosen for today. So this was really a kind of let's say 5-6 year long project. I'm still following Neuchâtel police today, quite a few years after the official end of the project. And together with a PhD student of mine, we were really allowed to assist the police, actually to integrate a working group within the police forces who was thinking about buying a new drone. So for years we have been able to follow them in their kind of process of selecting a drone, testing drones, going to technology fairs, doing exercises with them, inviting technology firms to do presentations, and so on and so on. So we could really study this kind of gradual establishment of a new relationship with the air from a kind of micro perspective. And that I think really offers some quite valuable, if not unique, insight into this kind of socio-technical construction of the technology, this kind of intertwined technical and social dimensions. So it's all about this kind of gradual imbrication of the solution, of the tool that will then later on be used. And if we want to understand the functioning, but also the implications of that tool, and also its actual fragility, its kind of messiness, to use that term again, we need to open up this black box and this whole kind of processuality and relationality that is kind of producing and produced by this kind of, as Jeremy Crampton has named it a few years ago, this kind of vertical assemblage that develops from the drone, and these kind of socio-technical constellations around the drone. And then the third case study is a Swiss startup who was actually developing a new spray drone, so for spraying pesticides in agriculture. And so this is not a drone for let's say, there are in agriculture drones that would have visual capabilities, for example, to identify water levels in the ground, or to identify specific problems on plants, etc. So they have quite developed, let's say, artificial intelligence capabilities inbuilt. But that one was really a spray drone. So I was also interested in kind of moving beyond the visual dimension of this technology and to think about other types of actions it allows to have. And also which then, of course, have other implications on action on the ground. And then the 2 other methods I will be drawing on this morning is, on the one hand, the public opinion poll, which I did actually 10 years ago. So of course it is becoming a little old, I do agree, I must confess, but I think it can still help us in a kind of exploratory way to also take on board actually let's say the approach from the population, the point of view from the population. I think that is one thing that is dramatically missing in existing drone research. So what do the people actually think about all that? And then the third one is a survey amongst professional drone users, which included different kind of public and private actors. The police, of course, I think there were about 150 representatives from the police participating across the whole of Switzerland, because in Switzerland, as elsewhere, drones have become like standard police tools. But also, as I mentioned before, urbanists, architects, archaeologists, photographers, people from the movie industry, farmers. So the whole range of kind of professional drone user was included in this. So that's the 3 kind of methods I will try to combine in my talk. So that's the thing. That was and eventually I give you a picture of a drone and moving beyond the kind of the artistic representations here. So that is the 50,000 Swiss franc drone that eventually Neuchâtel police bought. which doesn't really look that amazing, but it is actually quite a sophisticated engine, so it can fly at about 50 kilometers per hour, so it is really quick. It can actually even fly for very short periods of time. It can fly even a little quicker, so the idea is also, or was initially, to follow cars with the drones. What was interesting as well to study was that actually the whole process of buying a drone, which then made the police think, imagine all kinds of things, project all kinds of ideas onto the aerial realm, a lot of this actually really came from extremely informal personal driving forces. So it was not like a top-down politics that was, for example, kind of imposed by the direction of the police, or that could even have been coordinated on a, let's say, on a Swiss federal level. But it really came out of like kind of more like hobby passions of some specific police officers who just found it great fun to use drones, and who then integrated the technology. First, they actually literally took their own drone with them for police activities, which is of course extremely problematic because there was absolutely strictly no legislation around that. So it was extremely informal and kind of gray zone in terms of legal, let's say regulation. But it also shows, and again, this idea of where does this technology come from and how is it then kind of assembled. It shows this extreme complexity and messiness of the whole thing. And I think if we don't recognize that, we will not be able to understand the solution and the acting of the solution. So I'm really trying to argue here for a kind of opening up of these black boxes, of these kind of processual and relational constructions of the technology through detailed research. They also use, and my last slide will have a picture of that, they also use indoor drones, for example, to fight against kidnappings in apartments, where they could first send in the drone, stuff like that. So they also did quite a lot of exercises with that, actually. What else to say? Yeah, I think that's it pretty much. Well, maybe one thing, and I didn't mention that before, on one of the slides, of course, I had quite a few other names of people who kind of hugely inspired me, and I mean, one of those is Peter Adey, of course, and his understanding of the air. Derek McCormack has been an extremely important inspiration, especially his work on the hot air balloon, which to some extent does exactly what I'm trying to do through the drone. So think about the aerial realm as a kind of multi-dimensional reality rather than just as a kind of, let's say, material reality, for example. Steve Graham, of course, and his kind of understanding and working on the vertical. Stuart Eldon, so many others. So this, of course, kind of is also placed within a longer trajectory and tradition that now really starts to kind of happen and unfold in human geography and elsewhere, to think space and realities in a kind of volumetric sense. So to start, maybe the more analytical, empirically grounded part of my talk, so this first part on the air as a volume in which to act, just a few very, very basic numbers here. And the first one, you can't see the numbers in there, but that doesn't matter. What you see, the first one on the left, top corner, is actually the question, would your organization use the airspace without a drone? And you see that like 2/3 of the public institutions that participated in my survey, they say, no, we would not. And I would say about 4/5 of the private institutions, private organizations, they said likewise. So that is really, for me, quite an important starting point to say, well, the air is not something completely new, but quite a few people discover it in new ways. So of course I understand and I recognize that there have been police helicopters before, there have been airplanes, there have been all kinds of other technologies before, but the drone has made the air accessible in much more everyday kind of dimensions. Also in that working group in which I was kind of part and integrated, there were actually representatives from all over the police. So from the forensic department, from, of course, traffic security, the judiciary department. So the whole police, in a way, started to think about the air. So there is a gradual rather than a fundamental change here, but I think it is an important one if we want to think about the challenge that arises from this kind of proliferating use of the air by all kinds of novel actors, all kinds of novel interests, novel driving forces, etc. So it really makes it a societal question, how today to deal with this ever more populated air that becomes in ever new ways and ever more extended ways a societal phenomenon. So I think that's really the argument I want to make. And the one below, again, you can't see the numbers, but again, that's not really important. What you should take from the graph is that the huge majority, I would say almost 3/4 of those who said, yes, now we have a drone, they also say, well, now we could not do without it anymore. It has really established itself as a kind of standard thing. It has made the air become literally an everyday reality. And that's what I'm talking about here. That's what I'm trying to understand, these kind of everyday volumetric spaces in which all kinds of things happen, which become practical relevance for so many different milieus, so many different actors. Maybe, of course, a lot of them are commercially driven, so the air becomes also a commercial dimension. It becomes also invested with kind of monetary value. There's a lot of competition happening. So, for example, that startup I was studying in the Vallis, who did that spray drone, was very, very concerned about competitors. They really wanted to establish themselves as the new and only experts of the air. So there's all kinds of kind of competition dispute happening around the air as a novel way, as a novel volume in which to act, which of course becomes also a domain of specialization, of specific skills. And that applies to the police as it applies to other métiers, to other professions. And that has, of course, all kinds of new semantic values. That has simple, let's say, pragmatically defined values, so something that can be used to make money, to make things easier, to offer new services. Actually, the police told me, well, now thanks to the drone, we can do so many new things. And what we do, usually we do it more cheaply. Of course, they could ask for a helicopter if, for example, they had to search for somebody on the lake of Neuchâtel, and they did it before. But now they could use their own drone. They didn't have to go past other services. So it really made it, again, this kind of everyday dimension became so much more present. On the right, you have two kind of other graphs. And what we see here, and I actually asked them, well, could you do the same thing with a helicopter, or could you do the same thing with a camera? And they said, well, yes, mostly we could do the same with a helicopter, but definitely not with the cameras. And what I wanted to say from that, I mean, we spoke a lot about this remoteness of the drone gaze before, and I think that's fundamental. But what is even more fundamental, or at least equally fundamental, is the kind of flexibility and the mobility of the drone gaze. It's not just a way to watch spaces from afar, but also in extremely flexible, in extremely mobile ways. And that's exactly what the CCT camera misses. So I think it's much closer to another mobile logic of the kind of top-down gaze, which is related to helicopters, for example, or maybe airplanes, but not so much to the CCTV. And that's when I started understanding that my own starting point was kind of not really a relevant one to think about these politics of visibility conveyed by the drone. So I start with the police themselves, with what came out of the interviews, and one of the things that really came out, and that was almost systematically the first thing that I heard, was the concern with the weather, the elementality of the air in a way. So is it raining, is it winding, is it foggy, and they would never be talking about that I mean, they would maybe for private reasons, but not for professional reasons. So the drone really made them discover in novel ways the elementality of the air. And there was this interesting connection or relation between, on the one hand, the kind of agency of the drone, this kind of software-mediated agency to fix and stabilize its position in the air, and then the unsettling agency, the ultimately uncontrollable agency of the weather conditions. And there was this kind of interesting relationship between the two, which really, I think, is a central part in the way in which they actually discovered this kind of volume on which and through which to act. Another important thing that came up, and often very unconsciously actually, was that in many ways they related the air to the ground. And I think we talked about that before. Lisa just mentioned it also, or Karen actually, sorry, this morning when you mentioned the infrastructure question. And I think in so many different ways, this kind of airspace is also related to the ground. And one thing typically was that they would talk all the time about the built environment and how that would limit or not the drone usage. Tunnels, big problem. Suddenly becomes a big problem in novel ways, because driving with a drone through a tunnel is obviously much more complicated than in open terrain. Trees, and so on and so on. So there is this intrinsic relation between the volume above and actually what happens on the ground. Also in terms of legal conditions, so I mentioned before that it's not possible, it's not allowed to use the drone above gatherings of peoples, and that also applies to the police. Of course, there's an issue of private and public space here to consider. There are some specific cases of risk other than gatherings of people, like for example airports, nuclear power stations, but also protected sites, ecological reserves, for example. They could not use the drone above these. So again, all kinds of connections and imbrications of the different layers of space. And that's one of the things I really try to think about in my kind of political geography of the air, how it combines and brings together these realms or these dimensions. One thing that Lisa mentioned yesterday was this kind of the noisy volume. You talked so much about this kind of acoustic space of the air. And I really thought, well, there's such a great connection with my case study, although it plays out in very, very different ways, but it kind of brings the same kind of conceptual understanding with it. In my case, actually, the police was not so concerned with the noise of the drone as really a nuisance, because it is not that loud, but it can be heard by some people they actually want to monitor from afar. So typically they wanted to, for example, monitor drug dealings on the ground, and as soon as they hear the drone approaching, of course they would be alert, and they would maybe move away, they would maybe hide, and so on. So the noise was actually a problem for the police operation. And that also, and I think again, had an interesting implication in terms of the type of aerial politics of the drone gaze, because they really wanted a drone that could not only look down vertically, but that could look actually diagonally in front, so that they could watch the drug dealing, for example, long before they would hear the drone. So it's interesting to see the kind of connection of the airspace as a sonar or as an acoustic space, and the politics of visibility that then unfold in and through these spaces. What I like about the picture here on the right is actually this kind of this positioning of the police, and that's also something I really wanted to stress, this kind of embodied dimension of the air. I mean, this I think Simonsen has talked about that, this aerial neck, this kind of looking upwards. That's one thing. So the air is being internalized, embodied by its users. So it also has an extremely micro, almost biopolitical dimension to it. And of course, there's also another dimension to that, which is this obligation, again, in the legal realm, to actually keep the drone in line of sight. And that's really the expression that is used. So you have to position yourself in a way to always keep an eye on the drone and on the air in which it flies. So there's also a kind of a multi-sensory dimension listening, hearing, seeing, watching through and in the air happening there. So and I think, again, that really brings us to an important conceptual level on which to think about these kind of volumes that the drone makes us discover. The air becomes also a problem in new ways, of course, and that's really on which to act. So I've once read that the drone industry, so the drone producing industry, generates roughly the same revenue as the drone defense industry. So it's really this kind of cat and mouse game. New actors kind of territorializing the air and others defending the air. And here you have a few graphs from the public opinion poll, and what is very striking here is that actually they are really concerned about accident and potential terrorist attacks by private drone users. So there's quite a high level of public fear happening here. Whereas they are actually quite, let's say, open, if not demanding, for more kind of state usage of the drone technology. And that is an interesting thing, because when I started that project, I had another hypothesis in mind, which was this kind of democratization of the air. And from a popular perspective, this is definitely not happening right now. This should not be happening, let's put it that way. So there is kind of a strong resistance against this increasing commercialization and privatization of the air through professional and individual drone usage. And I'm talking about hobby drones here as well. So this also tells us something about the air maybe as a social reality, or as a reality of social togetherness. And of course, I connect that with a kind of Sloterdijkian understanding of the air as a sphere, as a space, a relational space of more or less easy, of more or less kind of problematic togetherness. So I think we also have to use this kind of spherical idea of the volumes of the everyday if we want to talk about the kind of multidimensionality and the problematics that unfold and are kind of inherent in all this. The police, of course, try to act on that. They try to defend space. They try to think about all kinds of techniques through which to act on the air as a volume. There is this wonderful example, and I mean wonderful especially in a kind of socio-technical sense, of Geneva police. They actually bought 2 eagle eggs because it is not considered to be allowed in Switzerland to train adult eagles. That would be considered as kind of problematic, but you can have baby eagles to actually educate them to fight drones. And in 2018, that was all over the media in Switzerland. Well, Geneva police bought 2 eagle eggs, which they want to use to fight against the drones. It has never ever been heard of again. So I literally don't know what happens to that, but I think it tells us so much about these kind of socio-technical, human and more human assemblages that kind of happen and disappear and happen again and disappear again around these kind of volumetric assemblages that are drone mediated. So I think that's always, when I try to understand or bring up a nice example of the kind of this vertical assemblage of the drone, I often use this idea of the police officers. I've never been there, sadly enough, but I can just imagine how they were standing around the cage with their little baby eagles and imagining all kinds of novel ways of kind of using the air and defending the air against this kind of risky, non-wanted drones. So again, yeah, so the air is inherently socio-technical. It is measured, defended in all kinds of ways, and it is imagined and reimagined, de-imagined, all kinds of very, very messy ways. Through which to act, and that's the third point here. So I've mentioned that before. So it is, of course, a perspective of action, which then mediates interventions on the ground. It becomes functionalized, it makes new things possible, it makes other things easier, cheaper. And the one here on the right level here, below, actually, and that was part of my comment to Ole earlier this morning, actually the huge majority of drone usage by the police is not so much about filming, it's simply about aerial photography. And if we talk about aerial photography, actually, in the huge majority of cases, it is about photography of accidents. So they really would use it in the let's say, the traffic security dimension, at least in Switzerland. That's the case. So I have to speed up a little bit, and I won't read the whole quote here, but this is a quote taken from one of the police officers, actually the head of that working group, who was talking about the use of drones to actually watch and do interventions in house fires. And not only to kind of pilot firefighters or to kind of direct them in their intervention on the ground. So that is again this idea of acting on other actions, but also in a sense of actually acting after the incidents. For example, looking at who was there. Because what he was saying is, in many cases, especially with arson incidents, actually the people who put the fire there, they are standing among the bystanders, the onlookers. So it's also, it kind of, and I think that's also been mentioned earlier this morning, it inscribes these volumes of the everyday within novel temporal logics, acting in real time, but also acting kind of in other temporal logics, anticipating things, but also then using the recordings and so on and so on. So I think the temporal dimension also needs to really be thought through quite carefully. So, of course, there's so much more to say, but what I was trying to basically just open up is this multiplicity, this messiness of novel relations with, on, and through the air that are kind of coming with the drones. This novel way of engaging with the air as a practical, cognitive, semantic, affective, embodied, power-loaded, defended, contested, fought after, etc., 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 space of the everyday. And I think in many ways these seemingly quite trivial examples, these quite kind of micro examples, they really show how the air or these kind of volumetric spaces of the everyday become ever more present and interact with all kinds of logics and rationalities of power that happen on the ground. And of course, and this is always the danger if we talked about the police, because that is of course a state actor, so they do have a lot of power, but I think there's so many examples as well to see how other groups actually mobilize that technology to maybe even resist to the police themselves. And I'm always tempted to mention this example of one of the manifestations in Istanbul recently, where there were these very striking images of the police standing on the ground and manifestors standing on the other side. And then both groups had actually their respective drones who were looking at each other. So it creates these very, very complex and messy kind of novel power relationships on, through, and within the air. And that really, for me, is the kind of invitation to think that further as a political geographer, and to think it further through novel vocabularies, through novel, maybe unexpected vocabularies, but also through novel, maybe unexpected situations and spaces. And that's really where I want to go with that. That's actually one of the pictures from an ancient former military bunker in Neuchâtel, which is now used for the police, or by the police, to train for all kinds of things. And one of the exercises I was allowed to assist was actually the training of like entering for kidnappings, entering with a drone into kind of apartments, trying to kind of fight kidnappers and so on and so on. So I really want to go in these kind of subterranean spaces now and see what they tell me about these kind of everyday politics of the air. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Francisco. Such a rich talk, and I think there will be many questions, so I will open up the debate right now. Emmanuel, please.
Yes, thank you so much for your vivid and clear presentation, and I especially liked your ability, how you narrate and gesture your research. And my question goes to the beginning, or probably also to the end. you mentioned the status of geography as imprisoned in a two-dimensional vocabulary, and your endeavor to find a so-called three-dimensional vocabulary and also metaphors. And next to the network or next to the map. And my question is, what have you found? Is it the messiness? Is it the volumetric assembly? Is it Sloterdijk sphere? And have you elaborated a little more or proved the, how shall I say, the function of these metaphors in your own research?
Yeah. So I mean, you mentioned Sloterdijk, and that is maybe the most obvious one for me. But it's not the end, but it's more like a starting point. And I did actually quite a lot of work on Sloterdijk and his kind of theory of spheres, and I kind of tried to combine that with maybe some more kind of geographical topics. Although Sloterdijk himself, and I think that's really the interesting, or one of the interesting sides of his work. For example, he talks a lot about enclosure. He talks about apartments and the kind of microsphere of the apartment. He talks about the stadium and the macrosphere of the stadium. So he kind of almost suggests a geographical operaalization of his kind of philosophy of sphere, of being with and being in, kind of being in spheres. So I mean, yeah, bubbles, foams, globes, I mean, that would be typically the kind of vocabulary we can take from there. What I've also tried to think through, and this is really very, very early days, is more like maybe not so much graphic metaphors, but maybe more like things like gravity, for example. Gravity is such an amazingly interesting concept, and I mean, there is such a volumetric dimension to that as well. And if we started to import these kind of vocabularies, gravity is one, then the kind of centrifugal forces, centripetal forces, these kind of, like almost physical concepts, but that do in a way imply volumetric dimensions, but I'm definitely not yet ready to make that case. But I think that's maybe one of the avenues I want to explore further, and also what I really want to explore further and to kind of complete the picture of the volume is to really think much more systematically about the subterranean volume. And of course, that brings back the question of the infrastructure as well. So as I mentioned, I am just about to finish a proposal on Swiss military bunkers. And these kind of labyrinthine, the labyrinth might be another really interesting concept, for example. So I've maybe 20 pages of quotes and ideas about the labyrinth somewhere in my computer, and one day I might actually work on that. So yeah, that's some ideas, but it's really just ideas.
Karen and then Brett.
Thank you, Francisco. I'm trying to formulate this as a question. So I'm kind of interested in the context of what counts as police in Switzerland. Because what counts as police in the United States is a sort of a shifting thing. I mean, in some ways there are many continuities, obviously, but especially right in this moment, what counts and who counts as police is dramatically changing, and there's an incorporation of people who normally would be vetted in, very rigorously. Now the standards are being reduced. There's just all kinds of ways in which the personnel, but also the institutional authority and the policies are in rapid flux. And the line between, say, border policing, community policing, et cetera, et cetera. So I would love to hear just a little bit more about that, because admittedly in a short talk, what I'm hearing is the police are just this thing. And that you're studying, but I don't have a context for their authority, or because, and that matters, because both Lisa and I have actually written articles about the use of drones by protesters, and in the cases that I've looked at, and it's one reason why we don't see a lot of use of drones by protesters in the United States right now, is that jurisdictions very quickly produce no-fly zones, you know, kind of at the drop of a hat, so that there are legal repercussions if you send up anything to take a look at what's going on from your side.
Sure.
But the police are able to operate theirs, which really puts the protesters at a disadvantage because
Sure.
they can't see. There are also instances where the police actually shoot, they just simply take the drones out if they're operated by anybody else. So it's perhaps a more contentious and conflict-ridden situation where I come from. But the access to air is so uneven, and even a little off-the-shelf drone that you could get at the department store or even the drugstore and, you know, try to use for your own purposes, very heavily regulated and very uneven in terms of who's having fun with it and who needs it in order to conduct a direct action. So I would just like to hear a little more about what counts as police in Switzerland.
Thank you so much. It's a very big question. Honestly, I don't have a kind of a structured answer to that. Maybe first of all, just to say, well, the police itself, probably in the US as well, which I don't know enough to say anything really, but at least in Switzerland is an extremely heterogeneous thing. So, I mean, you mentioned community policing, and that's definitely part of it. There is, of course, the kind of the crime dimension, the crime control, the kind of the more, let's say, the crime intervention squad. There's a scientific dimension in the forensics. So it's an extremely heterogeneous entity. It's almost impossible to talk actually of an entity. Also something that might be different in Switzerland to the US, I don't know really, but in Switzerland everything, you cannot imagine a more federalist solution to pretty much everything than what you would find in Switzerland. Meaning that, for example, police, there is of course a federal police, which is the kind of the Swiss police, and they would do, when, let's say, the kind of the dirty police work, you know, like organized crime, stuff like that. Border control, that would also be their kind of thing. But then there is cantonal police and there's municipal police. And actually one of the things is that a lot, if not most, of the police activity is regulated on a cantonal level. So for example, for video surveillance, as for drones, it progressed so slowly because each canton has or had to elaborate its own legal basis for it. So that slows things extremely down, but it makes it also very difficult to actually have a kind of a common ground. I try as a researcher to develop a kind of a critique of that because it's so different from one canton to another, but also for the police themselves to actually collaborate between the two, or between 3 or 4 police forces. So I would say it's an extremely decentralized thing in Switzerland. And also what we have to understand in Switzerland, I think there is this, especially on a military level, we have a kind of this what's the name? We don't have a professional army. Well, we do have a little bit of professional army, but then it is actually like the Swiss men have to do the military service. So it's much harder in Switzerland than it would be in other countries to actually really mobilize the military to do the dirty work of the police, because you would really ask kind of almost amateurs to basically fight against their own kind. So I think from that level, we maybe do not yet, and I hope it will stay that way, have this kind of trend right now of this kind of militarization of public order. But I mean, there's so much more to say. And maybe let me say one thing. I mean, and I'm acutely aware of that, this kind of connection of proximity and distance I have myself with the police. In Neuchâtel especially, because Neuchâtel is quite a unique case where the head of judiciary police actually used to teach at university in psychology. So he's really an intellectual, actually, and he celebrates that in a way. But that also opens up all kinds of, let's say, interesting but also uneasy collaborations, and I most certainly benefited from that. So I got access to all kinds of things I would not normally get. But then, of course, that also brings up all kinds of critical issues. How to keep away from it, how to keep a critical stance, questioning, and so on and so on. So there would also be a lot to say about the specific local conditions of Neuchâtel police. But maybe over coffee, that would be interesting. But thanks so much for the question.
Thank you. So we still have 2 questions, and we're running a little bit late, so please keep them concise, if possible.
Okay. So it's a question actually about the first of your Kandinsky paintings. So if you could actually flip back to the Kandinsky.
Sorry, which one?
The first one.
Which one?
Is it working now?
The Kandinsky.
Okay.
Oh, the Kandinsky.
Yeah, to the first of the Kandinsky paintings. And so I'm basically the question is I want to give you how I read the painting, and I want you to tell me in a version of the question he asked, how, based on your research, you read the painting differently, and how the communities of people that are working with these drones would read this painting differently. So, for instance, one of the things I would see in this painting, particularly with this transversal line, right, is a breakdown of the traditional organization of space in the landscapes and the other paintings, where this one, which is like from 23, right, for me it's a painting that's reacting to Einsteinian relativity. It's reacting to this idea that you're on a planet, so up and down lose their relationality. And this one, for me, is a breakdown of the traditional picture plane, organizing up and down, using perspective, as you would see in the other landscapes, and going towards a kind of flatness, right? But a new usage of the picture plane that would be very characteristic of expressionism, right? And so the question is, how do you read it differently based on all of the work you've done? How do people who work with this medium, what else would they see?
Sure. Wonderful question. Thank you so much. Well, this is really for me simply an illustration of some of the vocabularies I have been playing with, let's say. Really, it's kind of a playful endeavor, really, which I think is quite pleasurable, actually. So it's not for me an object to study, the painting. So that made me explain something. What I wanted it to say or to illustrate during my talk is really this combination of punctual, linear, and planar forces as they come together within a given space of painting. And the kind of the visual impression it creates. And I mean, maybe, I mean, you react in a way, I react in another. But what I found interesting, and this goes back to, for example, Kandinsky's more theoretical work, is to really show how the point kind of singles out specific portions of space for increased intensity. And I would then relate that to very specific logics of looking down from above. So, for example, on risky objects. For example, on, let's say, places of particular meaning, of particular concern. The line is, for Kandinsky, the point set in motion. So that would be the following of cars, in a way, the kind of the drone gaze as it sets itself in motion. Whereas the plane is then the rotating line for Kandinsky. So I would associate that, and I mean, I do develop that in that paper, actually, that's quoted on the slide. I would associate that with the kind of the capacity of the drone gaze to zoom in and zoom out. This kind of idea of changing the scale of vision and of visualization. And that's where the plane comes into being, in a way. And these things, they do in one way or another connect with each other. So I did in one paper, and in that one, actually in my book, I tried to to contrast that with a mapping I was involved in doing on the security dispositif during the European Football Championships 2008 in some Swiss cities. So I was mapping the security dispositif, and I saw all these punctual, linear and planar logic of organizing space, of controlling flows of spectators, of securing particular buildings, of particular points in space, of wider planar logics, whole city centers, or spaces around stadia, etc. And I kind of juxtapose these two visual impressions, and I then try to use Kandinsky's kind of theorization of these graphic elements to kind of think about the power dynamics that unfold in my case, in my empirical case. So it really makes me sensitive to specific logics of power, dynamics of power as they unfold. And of course, and I'm very, very explicit about that in my book, this has very, very clear limits and obvious problems as well. And one of the arguments I try to develop is that each kind of vocabulary in itself is problematic, and that's why I try to play with different ones and to combine them. I think we need to have language, and why not play with these languages in a kind of self-critical and playful way with a view to kind of flag up and place emphasis on some things which we would maybe not necessarily discover and place emphasis on through other vocabularies. And that's what I'm trying to do with these kind of things. I don't know if that's... Okay, thank you.
We have one last question by Lucrezia.
Thank you for the presentation. Very quickly, since you mentioned infrastructures, I was wondering if you, or in Switzerland, is already implementing the aerial corridors where drone can operate and for service or for emergency or transportation of goods.
They are not yet, I mean, they did testings. The Swiss Post, for example, did quite extensive testings of parcel deliveries. I know that it's also something that is currently being, let's say, tested and ever more frequently used by hospitals, for example, to get medication if needed. But it's not, I would say, on a stabilized level yet. It's actually one of those things, and I mean, maybe that's the right moment to ask this question, because it happens right now. It is being produced right now. I think one of the things that will, in one way or another, not stop it, but slow it down, is when the first real accidents happen. So I'm kind of waiting for that and to see what then happens to these kind of initiatives, these kind of novel infrastructures of, for example, parcel deliveries or hospitals or others. And I think that will be a critical moment to see once the media jump on it. Because right now it's very invisible. A lot is happening, a lot of exercises, a lot of first tests and initial kind of thoughts and approaches. But once really something happens, and for example, a big drone falls from the sky and hurts somebody or even kills somebody, what will then happen to all that kind of thing, that will be quite decisive, I think.
Very well.
I mean, that's a very socio-technical answer as well, because it's, I mean, that's what Latour says. I mean, these socio-technical infrastructures, they become visible once they break down, once they have accidents, once they have kind of issues. And I think that's going to be a really critical moment in the setting up and evolution of these kind of more stabilized infrastructures. They might happen, they might not happen. I don't know. It will be interesting to see.
Francisco, thank you so much for your talk and the beautiful discussion. So please.